Tonight, the question isn't what Donald Trump plans to say in his upcoming State of the Union address. The question is whether Americans are already delivering their own verdict on the state of the country. Because with less than 2 weeks before that nationally televised speech, the numbers tell a story that is deeply uncomfortable for this White House. Across multiple new polls released this week, a clear trend is emerging. Voters are signaling dissatisfaction. And perhaps most striking of all, even polling firms historically friendly to Republicans are showing troubling signs for the president. One such survey suggests that if an election were held today against his predecessor, the outcome would not favor Donald Trump. That's a dramatic shift in political gravity. And it lands just over a year after Trump stood on Inauguration Day promising strength, restoration, renewed global respect, and an end to what he described as political weaponization. The rhetoric was bold, the promises sweeping, but governing is harder than speech-making. Right now, Washington stands on the brink of another partial government shutdown. Funding for the Department of Homeland Security is set to expire, and negotiations remain tense. Democrats are resisting certain immigration enforcement strategies, arguing that recent operations have crossed ethical and legal lines. Republicans warn of security risks. The clock ticks toward midnight, and the political temperature keeps rising. In Minnesota, fallout continues from a controversial federal operation that resulted in the deaths of 2 American citizens during a protest-related confrontation months ago. That event triggered nationwide demonstrations and intense scrutiny of immigration enforcement tactics. In response to public pressure and mounting political cost, the administration has begun pulling certain federal immigration personnel out of the state. Local leaders are cautiously watching to see how permanent that retreat truly is. Meanwhile, legal complications deepen. Federal prosecutors are reportedly reviewing whether 2 immigration officers provided inaccurate sworn testimony related to a separate shooting incident. The case has already been dismissed, and both officers are now on administrative leave as investigations continue. Every development feeds a broader narrative, one centered on accountability, transparency, and the limits of executive power. At the same time, ripple effects from newly released materials connected to Jeffrey Epstein continue to move through elite institutions. A prominent corporate attorney has announced her resignation after correspondence became public. A major talent agent has reportedly lost high-profile clients. Overseas, a former European prime minister now faces corruption charges connected to dealings with Epstein. But notably absent from legal consequences so far are figures within Trump's immediate political orbit, despite long-standing public questions about past associations. The contrast fuels political debate. At the Munich Security Conference this week, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez addressed international leaders, calling for a renewed commitment to democratic norms and warning that perceived hypocrisy weakens alliances. She framed democratic accountability as not just domestic necessity, but global responsibility. Back home, economic anxiety continues to simmer beneath headline numbers that, on the surface, appear stable. Unemployment remains relatively low. Inflation shows signs of cooling. Job creation has not collapsed. But ask voters how they feel, especially younger voters. And the sentiment shifts. Surveys indicate that many Americans believe they were financially better off a year ago. Rising costs for healthcare, housing, and everyday goods weigh heavily on household budgets. Tariff policies have added upward pressure to prices in certain sectors. And while corporate profits remain strong, wage growth has not kept pace for many working families. Economic fairness, not just economic growth, is becoming the defining issue. Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich recently argued that this disconnect between macroeconomic strength and lived experience could shape the coming midterm elections. When voters feel insecure, they look for change. When they feel unheard, they look for accountability. And history shows that the party in power often pays the price. Trump himself has publicly questioned why the party controlling the White House so frequently loses congressional seats in midterms. While some dismiss his comments as rhetorical exaggeration, legislative proposals like the SAVE Act, which would require proof of citizenship documentation to vote in federal elections, have sparked fierce debate about voting access and electoral safeguards. Critics call it unnecessary and restrictive. Supporters argue it protects election integrity. But the broader question lingers: how secure do Americans feel about the democratic process itself? That concern extends beyond legislation. Recently, 6 members of Congress released a video reminding military and intelligence officials that they are not obligated to follow unlawful orders. The message echoed long-standing legal principles within the armed forces. Yet former President Trump sharply criticized them, even suggesting severe consequences. A federal grand jury declined to bring charges related to that video. Legal experts note that grand juries typically side with prosecutors. The refusal to indict signals that citizen panels are scrutinizing politically sensitive cases carefully. Public pushback is not limited to courtrooms. Across several cities, citizens have taken to the streets in peaceful demonstrations, voicing frustration over immigration enforcement, economic pressures, and what they perceive as executive overreach. Civic activism appears energized. As midterms approach, Democratic strategists face a strategic crossroads. How do they balance warnings about authoritarian tendencies with bread-and-butter concerns like healthcare costs and grocery bills? Polling consistently shows that voters prioritize kitchen table issues, but economic insecurity often intersects with political stability. People who feel financially vulnerable may also feel politically powerless. That convergence could define the next electoral cycle. Republicans, meanwhile, must navigate their own balancing act. Support for Trump remains strong within the party base, yet swing districts may respond differently to ongoing controversies and economic strain. The Senate map presents challenges for Democrats, but opportunities exist. House races appear more competitive. Governor's contests could reshape national messaging. All of it unfolds against the backdrop of a president preparing to address the nation. The State of the Union speech is traditionally a moment of confidence, a chance to project strength, vision, momentum. But speeches cannot erase public sentiment overnight. If polling trends hold, the administration enters that chamber under pressure. Pressure from economic dissatisfaction, pressure from immigration controversies, pressure from global diplomatic tensions, pressure from unresolved legal questions, and pressure from voters who are watching closely. The American political system is built on tension between branches of government, between parties, between power and accountability. What we're witnessing now is that tension playing out in real time. Courts are pushing back in certain cases. Congress is divided. State officials are asserting authority. Voters are signaling frustration. The coming months will determine whether that tension stabilizes or intensifies, because ultimately elections are referendums on lived experience. If voters believe prices are too high, they respond. If they believe government is overreached, they respond. If they believe promises have not been fulfilled, they respond. And if they believe democracy itself requires protection, they respond even more forcefully. The next chapter is being written now, in courtrooms and town halls and polling booths and on the floor of Congress. Donald Trump may soon stand before lawmakers and declare the State of the Union strong, but the real State of the Union is measured elsewhere, in public trust, in economic security, and in the willingness of citizens to demand accountability from those in power. And that verdict is still unfolding. Stay with us. The backlash didn't slow down after that vote. In fact, it intensified. What started as a dramatic moment on the House floor quickly evolved into a much larger conversation about the limits of presidential power, the importance of long-standing alliances, and the political risks of escalating rhetoric in a deeply divided country. The debate wasn't just about Canada anymore. It became a broader test of how far Congress was willing to go to reassert its authority when it felt that an executive move could damage strategic partnerships or destabilize markets. Behind closed doors, lawmakers from both parties were reportedly weighing not just the optics, but the economic implications. Canada remains one of America's largest trading partners, with billions of dollars moving across the border every single day. Energy, agriculture, automotive manufacturing, and defense supply chains are tightly integrated. Any serious disruption could ripple quickly through local economies in border states and far beyond. Lawmakers understood that even sharp words can carry financial consequences when investors interpret them as signals of future policy. As television panels dissected the moment, analysts pointed out that the tone of the debate had shifted. Earlier political clashes had focused on tariffs, border security, and trade negotiations. This time, the tension felt more personal. The president's language had drawn attention not only because of its policy implications, but because of its intensity. That intensity may energize loyal supporters, but it can also harden opposition, especially when it involves a close ally. In Canada, officials responded with measured restraint. Rather than escalate publicly, they reiterated the value of bilateral cooperation. Canadian leaders emphasized shared history, shared security responsibilities, and shared economic goals. That calm response contrasted sharply with the heated political environment in Washington, and it may have helped lower the temperature in global markets. The financial markets initially reacted with volatility. Currency fluctuations reflected uncertainty. Investors often price in political risk, and when rhetoric suggests possible disruptions to trade agreements, markets can move quickly. However, once Congress signaled it would not endorse aggressive measures, some of that uncertainty eased. Analysts suggested that institutional checks and balances reassured investors that abrupt policy shifts were less likely. Political strategists are already calculating what this episode means for upcoming campaigns. For supporters of the president, the confrontation reinforces an image of strength and willingness to challenge established norms. For critics, it reinforces concerns about unpredictability and strained alliances. The key question is which narrative resonates more strongly with undecided voters. What makes this moment especially significant is its timing. With election cycles approaching, every foreign policy decision can double as a campaign message. Allies become part of domestic political storytelling. Economic data points become campaign talking points. Even a diplomatic disagreement can be reframed as a test of leadership. Some members of Congress framed their rejection not as opposition to the president personally, but as defense of institutional authority. They argued that international partnerships should not become collateral damage in political disputes. Others emphasized the need for coordinated strategy rather than unilateral action. That framing may have been critical in building bipartisan support for the resolution. Meanwhile, grassroots reactions were mixed. Social media platforms lit up with heated debates. Some users praised the president's tough stance. Others criticized what they saw as unnecessary escalation. Digital discourse amplified every statement, often stripping away nuance and fueling polarized interpretations. In today's media ecosystem, a single phrase can dominate headlines for days. The broader geopolitical context also matters. North America's security architecture relies on close coordination between the United States and Canada, from NORAD operations to intelligence sharing. Any prolonged strain could have implications beyond trade. Defense experts cautioned that even symbolic fractures can complicate joint planning and strategic messaging. Energy policy was another undercurrent. Cross-border pipelines, electricity grids, and resource development projects depend on regulatory cooperation. Lawmakers representing energy-producing regions expressed concern that rhetorical clashes could jeopardize infrastructure investments. Stability and predictability are key to long-term planning in the energy sector. At the same time, some political observers believe that high-profile disputes can sometimes serve as negotiating tactics. In past administrations, strong language preceded concessions at the bargaining table. The challenge is ensuring that the tactic does not inadvertently harden positions on both sides. Diplomacy often requires balancing firmness with flexibility. What happens next will depend largely on tone. If rhetoric cools and discussions return to formal diplomatic channels, this episode may fade into the long list of political skirmishes that ultimately change little. If, however, escalation continues, the story could evolve into something far more consequential. One overlooked factor is public fatigue. Many voters express frustration with constant political confrontation. They may respond positively to leaders who demonstrate the ability to de-escalate. Congress's move could be interpreted by some as an attempt to restore a sense of stability and predictability in foreign relations. At the executive level, advisors are reportedly recalibrating messaging. Crafting statements that satisfy a domestic political base while avoiding international fallout is a delicate balancing act. Communication strategy becomes as important as policy itself. For Canada, maintaining a calm posture may prove strategically advantageous. By avoiding public escalation, Canadian officials position themselves as steady partners. That steadiness can resonate with business leaders and investors seeking reliability in cross-border operations. In Washington, committee hearings may follow. Lawmakers could call experts to testify about trade impacts, security coordination, and diplomatic precedent. Such hearings often serve dual purposes, gathering information and signaling political priorities. They can shape the narrative moving forward. International observers are watching closely. Allies around the world assess how the United States manages disagreements with close partners. The outcome influences perceptions of American reliability on the global stage. Ultimately, this episode underscores the strength of institutional checks and balances. The framers of the Constitution envisioned moments when branches of government would disagree sharply. Those disagreements, while dramatic, are part of the design. They ensure that major policy shifts undergo scrutiny. As the news cycle evolves, attention will shift to upcoming legislative agendas, economic data releases, and campaign developments. But the memory of this confrontation will likely linger as a case study in modern political dynamics. Whether it becomes a turning point or a temporary flare-up will depend on the choices leaders make in the coming weeks. Tone, transparency, and a willingness to engage constructively could transform tension into renewed cooperation. For now, the immediate crisis appears contained. Markets have stabilized. Diplomatic channels remain open. Congress has asserted its stance. The president's response, while forceful, has not yet translated into sweeping policy changes, and that may be the defining takeaway. In a political system built on shared power, even moments of fury encounter structural limits. The debate over how to handle relations with Canada will continue, but it will unfold within the guardrails of democratic process. As voters watch, as allies observe, and as lawmakers deliberate, one truth remains clear. In North American politics, the ties between the United States and Canada run deep. They have weathered disagreements before. The resilience of that relationship will once again be tested, not just by words, but by actions in the days ahead. If voters believe prices are too high, they respond. If they believe government has overreached, they respond. If they believe promises have not been fulfilled, they respond. And if they believe democracy itself requires protection, they respond even more forcefully. The next chapter is being written now, in courtrooms and town halls, in polling booths, and on the floor of Congress. Donald Trump may soon stand before lawmakers and declare the State of the Union strong. But the real State of the Union is measured elsewhere, in public trust, in economic security, and in the willingness of citizens to demand accountability from those in power. And that verdict is still unfolding. Stay with us.